Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Academy and IFAB Academy Value Added Programs Initiative. My name is Beate Schmidt, and together with my dear colleague Brigitte Franke-Brey, and I have the pleasure to guide you through today's webinar on the new European regulation for clinical trials with our expert speaker today, Dr. Birka Lehmann. So let me start quickly with some housekeeping information. There will be a couple of poll questions before and after the presentation that will pop up on your screen, and we invite you to participate. After Birka's presentation, we will have a Q&A session, so please type your questions into the questions area in the GoToWebinar panel. And when you leave the webinar, there will be a survey which only takes a minute to fill out, and we would appreciate your feedback. Let me now start with a brief introduction of the hosts and speaker of today's event. Next slide. My background is in drug regulatory affairs, and I've now been working for more than 20 years, both in industry as well as the European Medicines Agency. I've been a freelance consultant for the past 8 years, and I have the pleasure of being part of the IFAB Academy team as module coordinator in their medical affairs certification program. Next slide. Our speaker today is Dr. Birka Lehmann. She's a senior expert in drug regulatory affairs, and many of you probably know her for her leading roles in several European regulatory agencies. In fact, too many for me to mention here. Notably, Birka had leadership roles at the German Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices, the so-called BfArM, and multiple roles at EMA's scientific committees, including as a member of the Pediatric Committee, or PDCO. Birka has also served for 5 years as expert on secondment at the European Commission, where she was responsible, among other things, for the implementation of the clinical trial directive. As you can see, with her wealth of insights and experience, Birka is uniquely qualified to give us an update on the next big chapter in European clinical trials legislation, and we are delighted to have her give this presentation today. Next slide. And finally, let me introduce my co-host, Brigitte. Brigitte has a long and distinguished career in medical affairs, with leading roles in Ciba-Geigy, Sandoz, Quintiles, and Novartis. She also served as Director Europe, Middle East, and Africa for DIA, and was a clinical reviewer at Swissmedic. At present, Brigitte is consultant in pharmaceutical medicine, and she is joining me today as a member of the advisory board of the IFAB Academy. And with this brief introduction, I'll now hand over to Brigitte.
Thank you, Beate. Hello, everybody. Can we get the next slide, please? The topic for today is the implementation of regulation EU, the new European regulation 536/2014, which is following the original Directive 2001/20/EC that had come into force in 2004. The new regulation will be presented by Birka, and it will contain harmonized conditions for regulatory agencies, ethics committees, and applicants. There will be new timelines, transition periods. All of this will be outlined by Birka. Next slide, please. With the learning outcomes, thank you. The learning outcomes for today will be understanding the new requirements and timelines, learning about different approaches to receive the approval for starting the clinical trial, and understanding the interaction between regulatory agencies, ethics committees, national and multinational. Next slide, please. I hand over to, no, we have the poll questions now, 3 poll questions. Can they please come up? The first one, does the sponsor have to make changes in their SOPs in respect to clinical trial authorizations? There is a no and a yes. If you want to answer now. I think we can say that yes is correct and only moderate changes is correct as well. Now we come to the second poll question. does the sponsor have the freedom to submit multiple national CTAs in parallel in all European member states? There is a yes, there is a no, and I would ask you to fill in the answers now. And I think we can slowly go to the answer of this second question, the outcome. The answer yes, with 66% is of course the correct answer. And if we come to poll question number 3 now, please. Does the sponsor have to submit a dossier to the ethics committees separate from part 1 of the clinical trial application dossier? If you would fill in the answers. It's a yes. Part 2 goes to EC with 45%. Thank you very much, everybody. And I can now hand over to Birka to start her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Next slide, please. And thank you very much, IFA Academy, to invite me to give some information regarding the new regulation on clinical trials. As you already mentioned in you gave information regarding your knowledge on the new regulation, I can say that you are highly informed already about what will come new. So, but I hope I can nevertheless give you some additional information. Yes, for the moment, when you are making an application for a clinical trial, you have to submit your application in each European member state to get an approval by an ethics committee and a competent authority. This will be changed with the new regulations of 536/2014. Next slide, please. The new regulation has 19 chapters, 19 articles, and I will focus only on the Annex 1 and Annex 2, which are in relation to the application of the dossier for an initial application and the application dossier for substantial amendments and the timelines which are going with them. Next slide, please. This is just an overview coming from the European medicines agencies, giving the information how the new system will work, which means there is a hand-in-hand working together between the applicants, the sponsors, and the national competent authorities and the ethics committees, and these all will be handled within a so-called portal system, and I will come back to this in my last part of my presentation. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, I will focus on application dossier for applications and substantial amendments. Next slide, please. The new regulation will be a specific one where we want to see that the handling of clinical trials application will be more in a fluent procedure. That means everybody takes part in a so-called clinical trials information system. That means that the information coming from the sponsors of the clinical trials goes in a trial system where the national competence are working with this information, and the outcome of the discussion internally of the national competent authorities and the ethics committees also will distribute it back to the sponsors via these clinical trial information system. So this is a really new interaction between competent authorities, ethics committees, and the sponsors. A side effect, or let's say an additional effect of this new clinical trial information system will be that the public will get early information regarding clinical trials, but I will not touch on this during my presentation today. Next slide, please. The new application will be handled in two parts. You will have to submit the part 1 to the national competent authorities, and the part 1 contains the information of the medicinal product which will be handled in the clinical trial regarding the new therapeutic benefits, the investigation medicinal product, the risk to subjects, the investigation medicinal product dossier, the labeling in the investigation data information. We have the so-called part 2, which is focusing on the institutions who are conducting the clinical trial and which are more focusing on the information which will be submitted to the patient. That means the part 2 has the content of the informed consent, recruitment, issuance, rewards for investigation, compensation, and the quality of the investigator. In principle, part 2 has only been submitted to an ethics committees. Due to the possibilities in the European legislation, it's also possible that some member state can invite ethics committees also to take part in the evaluation of part 1. And I will come back to this in one of the next slides. Next slide, please. The clinical trial application can be submitted, part 1 and part 2 in parallel, but they can also be submitted in sequence. But the time difference between the submission of part 1 and part 2 should not be longer than 2 years. In principle, the timing of substantial amendments is in line with what we will see for the timing of the approval of the clinical trial application by itself. We will have a single application dossier, and this is only an excerpt out of the whole content which have to be submitted. That means it's the introduction, the cover letter, the EU application form, protocol, investigators brochure, IMPD, scientific advice, and if you have to develop a medicinal product also for the pediatric population, then the pediatric investigation plan, the content of the IMPD labeling, the recruitment arrangements and suitability of investors, and so on. Next slide, please. Till now, we had the situation that ethics committees and competent authorities have worked in parallel, not together. With this new concept of the situation that the sponsor submits his application to the information system, that brings the situation that competent authorities and national ethics committees have to work in widest sense together. That means when you are submitting for part 1 an application, for example, to the national competent authority in Germany, the BfArM, the dossier will also be handled by an ethics committees. The ethics committees and the national competent authorities have to work together, in the meaning that by the end of the day, the approval or non-approval letter will contain both positions, the positions of the ethics committee and the national competent authorities. This is the one really new issue regarding the clinical trial application. The second new one is that you don't have to discuss your application with all other national member states, but you are asked to nominate one national competent authorities as your reporting member state, and then these reporting member state has to liaise with all the other member states to come to an agreement of the approval or non-approval of the clinical trial application which were submitted. That means the so-called LMS, in this case it's the reporting member state, has to deal with the participating or concerned member states that all the information and all the questions and recommendation comes in one letter back to the sponsor to work with these comments on his application form if it is necessary. Next slide, please. The timelines was one of these things which was heavily discussed during the implementation of the directive of clinical trials. So now the regulation will, in the writing of the regulation, these difficulties has been taken into account, and it was said that all the timelines has to be shortened. And I give you just an overview how the new timelines are now. That means the applicants will submit his application, then it will give a validation period for 10 or 7 days for part 1. When everything is fine, then the reporting member state has to give out a draft assessment report by date 26 after start of the procedure. Then the concerned member state or participating member states have 12 days to give their comments back to the reporting member states. Then if we have a consolidated final assessment of the reporting member state, the sponsor will get this information, and by the end of the day, after 7/5 days, you will get a decision from the reporting member state and the concerned member state if your clinical trial application has been agreed upon. The same holds true in principle for the part 2. That means these part 2 would only be submitted to the ethics committees. That means there is also a validation time of 10 days. Then there's an assessment step of 45 days and a decision by the ethics committees within 5 days. So that if you are proceeding with part 1 and part 2 in parallel, that by the end of an evaluation time of 50 days, you will get a single decision for part 1 and you get a single decision for part 2 from the ethics committees. Next slide, please. This is the best case, let's say. The regulation also takes care of the situation when not everything runs perfectly through. Then we have some possibilities for the sponsor to interact with the national competent authority or with the ethics committees in respect to questions coming up, for example, before the validation will be finalized. That means in the validation phase for part 1, if a national competent authority has questions, the sponsor has 10 days to answer the questions. Then there will be 5 days time for the reporting member state to validate the sponsor's answer. When this will done in a good way, then the procedure will start. Then the reporting member states had 26 days for his first assessment. If he has questions back to the sponsors, then the sponsor has 12 days to react on this. Afterwards, the reporting member states had 7 days for the coordination, 12 days for the concerned member states for the discussion with the reporting member states. By the end of these 19 days, there will be a 12 days extension consultation with all the member states, so that by the end of the day, we will have a decision on day 74. If during this procedure additional question comes up, for example, after the reporting member state has an extended consultation with the concerned member state, then the applicant has also a 5-day slot to give back information so that the reporting member state can find a decision at latest by day 74 of the procedure. In principle, these are the same timelines for the ethics committees by the evaluation of part 2. That means we have a validation. The sponsor have the possibility to answer questions within 10 days. When these will be positive, then there will be the start of the procedure after 45 days. If the ethic committees has some question, then the sponsor have to answer within 12 days. And the ethic committees have 19 days for the agreements. And by day 47, there will be the decision coming from the ethic committees regarding the approval of the clinical trials application. Next slide, please. We have the same or similar timelines regarding substantial modifications. That means we are going in the wording back from substantial amendments, which we had during the clinical trial directive. When it is in force, we have now the wording substantial modification for the clinical trials, where we have also validation times, where we have time for the applicant to answer. We have this nearly similar timelines. That means when everything works well, then you will get the agreement to a substantial modification within 43 days. If there are coming questions from the national competent authorities, then the applicant has in the validation phase 10 days to answer questions. And during the evaluation phase, he has 12 days if there are coming questions in respect to the consolidation phase, so that by the end of the day, when taking into account all extensions, then the procedure should be finalized by 77 days after start of the procedure. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. As I mentioned before, this is a new approach that you have a reporting member state and that you can go with the reporting member state to interact with the so-called concerned member state. It might be a situation that you will have in the first step thought about only inviting 2 other member states to participate in these clinical trial application. It is possible to include additional member states during the procedure, but these member states then have also a say in respect to what was decided during a so-called first round. And that means a concerned member state which disagree with the conclusion on the first round have to communicate the disagreement with detailed justification through the EU portal. So we hope that we will get even if you are including an additional concerned member state in a second round or in a third round, that we can still have the basis for the clinical trials ongoing in the same way like it was agreed in the first round. Next slide, please. I just want to make some additional comments regarding the new regulation. That means, as I mentioned before, that part 1 and part 2 should, or we hope, will be submitted in parallel, but you can submit it separately. But the time between first submission and submission of part 2 should not be longer than 2 years, then you have to start again. The clinical trial application can be withdrawn at any time. For example, when you have the impression that you cannot stick to the timelines for your answering time. So you can withdraw, you can submit your application any day, any time. And as I mentioned before, the addition of a new concerned member state, then the new member state have 52 days. Protocol should be improved. Next slide, please. This is an overall overview. What will be new? That means we will have to summarize it, a validation time of 10 to 15 days. We have an assessment time 45 to 76 days. We have a reporting to notification of 5 days. So we have an overall timeline for the clinical trials application of 60 to 106 days. The addition of a new member state will be 52 days, and for substantial modifications, we will have 6 to 21 days. For assessment, 36 to 69 days, outcome notification 5 days, and overall duration will be 49 to 95 days. Next slide, please. These new timelines were discussed very in depth in the European Union, and many of the national competent authorities and the ethic committees, which will also be involved in the part 1, had the impression that it is necessary to have something like a pilot project or something like an idea how it can be handled in the new timeline, especially for the sponsors' times, which are now shortened. So there are some agencies which are providing additional information how to work within the new regulation, even if it's not in force. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, it has 2 new principles. One principle is the interaction of the ethic committees with the national competent authorities. And the second step is that you have a leading national competent authority within the application process. We had this idea of the leading or reporting member state already in the voluntary harmonization procedure, which was used by some of the sponsors, but not from all of them. And we had the impression that it was a useful step in the direction for what is now coming with a new regulation. Next slide, please. The so-called voluntary harmonization procedure was handled even if there was not in principle a legal framework for this, but it was something like a process to see if the mutual recognition can also be implemented like we have it in the marketing authorization. Now, as I mentioned before, it's not only that the national competent authorities are involved in such the new procedure, but also ethic committees has to be involved in the clinical trial application approval. So the national competent authorities in Europe have decided to go with the so-called voluntary harmonization procedure plus. That means that the national member states even try to find good solutions for their interaction between the national competent authorities and the ethic committees, because in some member states these have different legal basis for an approval of a national competent authority and an agreement of an ethic committees. Therefore, in many member states there have to be found legal agreements how to solve this problem regarding the giving an information back to the sponsors, which contains the ethic committee's comments and the competent authorities' comments. Next slide, please. Not all of the member states are going this way, and I have just summarized for you in this slide the information which of the member states already working with this so-called voluntary harmonization plus. For example, Austria works with this, Finland, France, Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Hungary. They are all working already in a so-called pilot phase to come to the situation that they get a training, let's say, how it works when the national competent authorities are working together with the ethic committees, and when both are coming to an agreement and this information goes out to the sponsor, and how the sponsor works back or gives answers to the comments coming from these combined approval. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we do have the so-called pilot project, where even under the situation that the Directive 2001/20 is still in force, the national competent authorities that we want to train each us and the sponsor how to work within the new regulation. And I'm giving you here the example of the pilot project from the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices. That means we had to come to the conclusion, first of all, and you see it on the left-hand side, that we have to decide how many ethics committees were involved in the evaluation of part 1. And on the other hand, we have to see how the sponsor can work with these new timelines. That means we have on the one hand side the close interaction between the ethics committees and the national competent authorities. This is one part of the pilot, and the other part of the pilot is does the sponsor really can adjust their SOPs to these new frameworks. Next slide, please. And this is just an excerpt of this publication from the Federal Institute for Drug and Medical Devices, where they are saying, yes, we had a clinical trial application. We see the competent authorities is the B firm. We see the ethics committees of the Rhineland was involved. It was a monocentric clinical trials. The validation was the 3rd of August, and by the end of the day, it was done within the time frame as it is given by the new regulation, and it means it was evaluated in the time which is ongoing. We see that we had the situation that the national competent authorities and the ethics committees have a divergent position. That means these applications had then to be transferred back to the normal condition like we have it under the Directive 2001/20. That means even if you have submitted under the pilot project and we have the impression that we didn't come to a good conclusion for this application, then we're shifting it back to the rules like it is in the directive. We had another case where and this is the 3rd arrow, where it was said that in this application, even if the sponsor had the idea to join this pilot project, that he couldn't work within the time frames given for the new regulation. That means they have to be denied to work within this pilot project. And we had with the 4th arrow the situation that even in this pilot project, sponsor had answered the questions in the right timeline. So in the validation and in the evaluation phase, so that the end of the procedure was positive. So you see, it is very interesting to see how the pilot project is working. It really gives the possibility to see how the interaction is between the ethics committees and the national competent authorities to go forward with these, let's say in brackets, harmonization. And we also see sometimes that the sponsors are not in a position to really answer the questions or the comments coming from the ethics committees and the competent authorities in the right time, according to the new very short timelines coming from the regulation. Next slide, please. Just to give you a short highlight regarding the situation which we are focused now, and this is regarding the clinical trials in COVID-19. Even the clinical trials facilitation group, that means this is a working group of the heads of medicines agencies, that means of all national competence authorities, working together to giving out a recommendation how a clinical trial can be conducted in the framework of COVID-19. There is a guidance for these specific situation, and I just want to mention some ideas coming from these implication of coronavirus disease on methodology, aspects of ongoing clinical trials, and also regarding the guidance on clinical trial management. Next slide, please. In principle, these clinical trials facilitation group gives out also a recommendation regarding the conduct of complex clinical trials, which in this case is has to be seen in the framework or in the light of the COVID-19 situation. Next slide. And yeah, they are giving information regarding the conduct of the clinical trials, and if you are doing this the development in one trial, or if you want to do a trial in separate trial, then they are giving just as the information regarding a master protocol can be used in any time of a complex trial. If it used a separate trial, the cover letter and protocols of each of trial can refer to the common shared master protocol. So there's this one information regarding conducting clinical trials in COVID situation. And next slide, please. Whereas there is also giving the information regarding how many arms it might be useful and how you have to submit your protocol in the right way to get an agreement for these protocol for a COVID-19 treatment. This is just to give you an idea how many groups are working on this issue besides the decision-making process or the recommendation coming from the European medicines agencies in respect to COVID-19 issues. Next slide, please.
Birka, just very quickly, we should probably finish in around 5 minutes so that we have enough time for Q&A.
Yeah, I think I will manage. Yeah. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'm now coming to the CTS. This is the electronic system, which is the key for all the new situations in Europe. Next slide, please. And the clinical trial information system is necessary to harmonize the assessment and supervision of processes in clinical trials. The CTS will contain the central portal and the database, and the European medicines agencies will set up and maintain the CTIS. Next slide, please. And this is really the key, that the CTS is working. That means that we have the chance for a single electronic submission of the data, that we can streamline and coordinating the clinical trial between member states, that we can streamline safety reporting, that we can supervise the clinical trials, and that we have this transparency for public. Next slide, please. The CTS is the key for all the changes which will come. That means only in the moment when the CTS will be in place and applicable, then it will take 1 year more and the regulation will come into force. That means in the time between, you can still submit your clinical trial application according to the Clinical Trial Directive 2001/20. If the CTS will be in place, then you have sometimes to either submit your clinical trials according to the old directive, or you can also submit your clinical trial application according to the new regulation. Next slide. There are also some informations which are already available coming from the European Medicines of Agencies and the European Commission regarding the arrangement for transitional period. And I just want to highlight you to this information. Next slide, please. As I said before, that the CTS is the key. Everybody is waiting for the audit of these CTS, and we are still in the situation that we don't have the CTS really completed. We hope that it will be completed this December, and then it will go for a pilot phase by itself, so that the implementation of the regulation will not be earlier than 22, for example. Next slide, please. This is just an overview how, in principle, the CTS will work, and you have seen this, I think, from Fergus Sweeney from the European Medicines Agency. And this brings me to the next slide. That the European Medicines Agency has now on their website a so-called Cts Highlights Document, where Fergus Sweeney and his colleagues will update you regularly on what is happening to the CTS and by when we can expect that it's really working, so that we can go forward with the whole regulation, and it will come into force in the next years, I hope, in 2022. Next slide, please. This is just for you to highlight that even the European Commission has already updated their Euralex portal. Next slide, where they are. Next slide, please. Where they are giving you the information. Next. What to do during the transition period, what to do with your application, and that they have already updated the whole bunch of information. On the one hand side, you can see what is still the set of documents which you needed according to Directive 2001/20, and what will be the documents which you need when the new regulation will come into force. With this, thank you very much. Next slide, please. And this brings me to the end, and now I give it back to Brigitte.
So we have the remaining poll questions. Number 4 is, how many days does the sponsor have to answer questions during the clinical trial validation phase? You have 4 different answers, and I ask you now to click on what you think is the correct answer. The correct answer with 41% is 10 days. Thank you. And now to question number 5. How many days does the sponsor have to answer questions during the assessment phase of the clinical trial application? So it's 12, 10, 7, or no limit. If you would like to choose an answer. Yeah, that's tricky. 29% got it right. It's 12 days. We go to question number 6, please. By which date is the new regulation finally applicable? That's A, B, C, D for your choice. Please answer what you think is the correct answer. 37% got it right when the clinical trial information system will be approved. And the last question, number 7, please. According to the new regulation, will you receive an ethics committee opinion for part 1? Please make your choices. And it's the first answer with 44%. So thank you very much for answering these questions, and I hand back to Beate for general questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte, and of course, Birka, for this fantastic presentation and the insights. We have already received a couple of questions, but I also invite all other participants who haven't done so yet to post their questions in the GoToWebinar panel. One question was actually posted at the very beginning with the first poll question. It was more a comment about the changes to the SOP and whether they're major or minor, related to the very short response period sponsors will have under the regulation. So maybe, Birka, you can briefly talk about, and you have also mentioned in your pilot at BfArM, that at least one company had to drop out because they could not complete their responses in the short period of time. What's your expectation? What was the consideration for this very short time period that cannot be extended?
Yeah, the background for putting these short timelines in the regulation were the complaints of the industry that they always had the impression that the approval of clinical trials takes too long. With all the discussions from, I think, 2012, 2013 on, it was always discussed how can we shorten the timelines for the competent authorities, which we have done from 60 to 45. But it also was the information that many of the long-lasting times were really in respect to the situation that sponsors couldn't answer. And therefore, it was the agreement between the member state that they said, okay, we want fixed days for the sponsors to answer. That means we want to see the answers in the validation time within 10 days and in the assessment phase with 12 days. After the regulation was finalized in 2014, I discussed a lot with companies, and they said yes, but this means that we have to change a lot of our agreements because, for example, in international clinical trials, I can't get so quickly the answer to some of your questions or to some of the changes. But by the end, it was really on the wish list of the pharmaceutical companies to shorten the timelines.
Excellent, thank you very much. So yeah, it will obviously be a major change, especially for big companies, but all in the interest of keeping the overall procedural timelines shortened. Then we had a question, Birka, can you comment maybe on the criteria that sponsors should apply, if any, when selecting the reporting member state, or how do you select this member state?
This is difficult to answer. Nevertheless, I think first of all, you might have already experiences in some member states. You have a good relationship with the centers in the member states, that you will get enough recruitments in one of the member states. So I'm a little bit hesitant to advertise really one of the member states. Mm-hmm. For me, it is more interesting to see that some of the member states are already in a self-preparing phase for the new regulation, and that I think they are wanting to support the new regulation and the new timelines, and even are working hard on these interactions between ethics committees and national competent authorities. Perhaps these are the member states which are, let's say, very interested in getting forward with the new regulation and the clinical trial applications, to make it a little bit neutral.
And do you know, will there be like time slots, like with the mutual recognition or decentralized procedure?
Not for the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we have one question that asks whether whether this procedure will be the same for investigator-initiated trials, whether there are any exceptions.
The same.
Then we have another question. Could it be that only, sorry, what will happen if part 1 is refused or not validated? What happens to part 2 if both were presented at the same time?
As far as I remember, you can resubmit, or you are withdrawing, even part 2.
Then we have a very interesting question. It's more, you know, a broader question. Do you think, what's your opinion, will the implementation of the clinical trial regulation make Europe a more attractive place for clinical trials, which I guess is also one of the reasons?
I hope. We are working so hard on this issue to get more clinical trials back to Europe and to be a good place for conducting clinical trials in Europe. We tried it with the directive, and I agree this was not a really step forward, but it took us all effort to come to this rolling regulation, which means that the member state doesn't have the freedom to implement legislation like they wanted, like we had it in the directive. So that we hope that with this new regulation, we really make it much more attractive to conduct clinical trials in Europe. Yes, that was the whole thing behind this new regulation, and I hope it will work.
And I actually missed the part 2 of the question earlier about IITs, investigator-initiated trials. Will the sponsors, the investigators' confidentiality be maintained?
Yes.
Good. I had a question actually when you talked about the currently ongoing voluntary VHP Plus, and some member states already being engaged in pilot projects, but not all of them, not all member states. Is there an intention to share information from these pilots, train those agencies that have not participated in pilots? How can sponsors be assured that all the agencies will be up to speed once the system comes in?
I mentioned the clinical trial facilitation group, which is, let's say, this group who are harmonizing all the national competent authorities for the clinical trials. They are giving information, they are learning by each other, they are giving out information to each other how to conduct these situations. The most difficulties I still see with these voluntary plus is that some of the member states don't have the possibility to bring the interaction between the ethic committees and the national competent to closer together. Even in Germany, we needed a specific legislation that the ethic committees and the national competent authorities can give out and, let's say, agreed evaluation. This has taken, I think, 1.5 year discussion with lawyers between ethic committees, the Ministry of Health. By the end of the day, we found an agreement, and they even have now to train on decision taken by each other. But I think in many of the member states are in principle willing to do this, but they are a little bit hesitant regarding the national legislation, how they can deal and manage this. When the regulation will be in place, they have to do it, but I hope they will think about it beforehand, how they will manage. But I heard from some of the member states that some of the member states mentioned they needed the regulation before they can interact in this way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think these are aspects that not all of us as sponsors always consider. Just a quick follow-up question regarding the confidentiality of a sponsor in an investigator-initiated trial. The question is, if everything is being made public in the CTIS, the sponsor confidential, the sponsor would be disclosed. So I guess
yes. It's the same rules like we have it with all publications from the European Medicines Agencies, that everybody has to be look carefully that not confidential information goes out to public, and the rules in principle the same, that those who has the dossier in his hand makes a comment what is confidential and what not.
Okay, but in principle, I mean, of course, it will be disclosed that the study is being conducted. Excellent. I think we have covered most of the questions that have come in. We have 2 more minutes if anyone still wants to quickly post a question and take the unique opportunity to ask a question to Birka. Talking about confidentiality, would the investigator brochure remain confidential?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that won't change.
There's no change. There's no change in the regulations. The only thing is the publication of the results of clinical trials, and that you need by the end of the day also a so-called lay summary for the results of your clinical trials. But everything stays
currently already.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just see. I see no more questions. I think we've covered it all.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the audience. Thank you to you both.
Thank you
very much in time. So this brings us to the end of today's conversation with the Academy. On behalf of my co-host Brigitte and the IFAP Academy, I'd like to extend a big thank you to Birka, our expert speaker today, for her extremely valuable insights into the new EU clinical trial regulation. Thanks, of course, to all of you who attended today and for your questions and participation. Please remember to register also for the next webinar, which is on December 17th. It will actually be a panel discussion on health economics and outcomes research. And you can also sign up for our mailing list to be informed about future events at ifapacademy.org. We are looking forward to welcoming you at our next events. Until then, thank you all and have a good rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.